Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. Widely considered one of the greatest military blunders in human history. The following is an eyewitness account of Napoleon's failed Russian campaign, graciously translated by Jonas De Neef. These are their words. These are their thoughts. This is what they experienced. Hubert Lyautey, born July 13, 1789. He wished to become an artilleryman. He applied for the École Polytechnique in 1805 and was accepted. He would graduate as a lieutenant in the 5th Horse Artillery Regiment. He kept a well-detailed diary of his campaigns with the Grande Armée. He was present at many battles, including the Battle of Wagram, where he was nominated for the Cross of the Legion of Honor. He'd then be assigned to the Imperial Guard Artillery. In 1812, Hubert received his next assignment. He'd be sent with the greatest army ever assembled in Europe to partake in Napoleon's Russian invasion. This is where our story begins. Crossing of the Niemen, 23 June 1812.
Our two companies arrived early on the Russian bank and remained there throughout the army's passage near the small pine forest, which the army bypassed either to the right or to the left. I thus had the privilege of witnessing a magnificent spectacle. The Polish or Prussian bank overlooked the other. From there, I was able to observe for the operation and part of the construction of the 3 bridges, because we were stationed overnight on the heights near the Emperor's tent. 3 ravines descended from there, and it was through these openings that I then saw the army approaching the bridges. What magnificent troops! What splendid cavalry! I can still picture them marching past us as if on parade. And how did they cross that same river a few months later? This distressing comparison, had it been anticipated, would have completely spoiled my enjoyment of this marvelous sight. But nothing marred it at the time. The season was favorable, the sun was shining brightly, our confidence in our leader was still intact, and nothing prevented the imagination of a 22-year-old from blossoming in the face of such splendor. It heralded the storms that broke out a few days later and caused so much harm to the entire army. We approached Kovno on the 26th, and then headed for Vilna through sandy woods and fairly rugged terrain. We had barely set out when storms broke out. Soldiers from the guards were killed by lightning on the road. Cold, persistent rain caused further misfortune, with several thousand horses perishing and being left on the road, along with a number of carriages, even artillery carriages. We were customarily attached to the cavalry, divided into 3 divisions, the Lancers, the Dragoons, and the Horse Grenadiers. These fine troops often marched together and accompanied the imperial quarters. I can still recall certain bivouacs at the edge of the woods. On warm evenings during this delightful season, regimental bands would play in succession at dusk. While the sun, setting late this time of year at this high latitude, continued to illuminate the myriad of scenes offered by the layout of the terrain, the men, and the horses. Everyone, having no reason yet to foresee an unfortunate future, took part in this grand scene and enlivened the conversation during supper. After that, once a layer of straw had been prepared, along with the horse portmanteau for a pillow and the colback for a nightcap, they lit their pipes and chatted until they fell asleep, which did not take long, bringing the day to a close and preparing for the next one. Sometimes a horse which broke free from its restraints would come and pull the straw from under your head. You had to chase it away, and thus awakened, you were treated to the sight of the long lines of campfires, occasionally illuminated by the moonlight. At dawn, which occurred early, the sounding of reveille, played repeatedly with fanfare and variations across the entire front line, prepared you for the new day. Then, after morning soup, the trumpet sounded the signal to mount your horse. It was a splendid sight to behold, these long lines of cavalry spreading out across the plain in several columns. However, when the rain replaced the fine weather, and also when the cold set in, then farewell to the magic of the bivouac. One then experiences only its harshness. In order to appreciate this kind of life for any length of time, one must be young and enjoy good weather. nor is there any beauty in a troop when they are wading through mud. The landscape remained unchanged, a vast plain, more or less cultivated, with pine and birch woods, but few dwellings. In some places, the very light soil, churned by the troops marching in several columns, raised black dust and made it impossible to see even the nearest objects. Concentration of troops heading for Smolensk made the journey slow and arduous, especially up the Dnieper, which was crossed at Orsha, where a bridgehead had been constructed. Beyond this river, as far as Smolensk, the countryside became better and more populated. But the difficulty of the march was not reduced because we marched several times off the roads, and some water crossings were not without danger. I remember that near a mill, the bridges built for the region's light vehicles collapsed under the weight of our cannons, causing us inconvenience and delay. By advancing towards Vilna, Napoleon intended to cut the Russian army in two. By moving from Vilna to Vitebsk, and then from Vitebsk to Smolensk, he was, moreover, on the verge of outflanking his opponent. The 18 days spent in Vilna and the 12 days in Vitebsk allowed him to rally the delayed corps. By moving up the Dnieper beyond Smolensk, he hoped to outflank the enemy. We found the Divna at Bizhankovsky. We saw the Russian force retreating toward a village marked by a magnificent church, but it did not hold out. Our cavalry, though few in number, we followed the road on the left bank, which leads from Vitebsk via Ostrovno.
The Battle of Ostrovno, 26 July 1812.
A rather lively engagement took place near Ostrovno on 26 July. It is there that I saw dead and wounded soldiers for the first time since the beginning of the campaign. They belonged to the 5th Hussar Regiment, which had been with us at the Battle of Wagram. I also saw quite a few Russians, some of whom belonged to the artillery. They were recognizable by the triple-tipped grenade on their cartridge boxes and shakos. The latter are very low, yet very wide at the top. I saw 6 guns captured from the Russians on the road. I was there, witness to what can be called a point of honor, inappropriately invoked, especially in the presence of the enemy. One artillery column had cut off another, both wanting to arrive first and no doubt follow the troops to which they were attached. A quarrel ensued between the commanders. It was a matter of moments before they dismounted and drew their sabers. I passed by shortly after the dispute and recognized the wounded man as a squadron commander of the 5th Regiment on horseback. The hope, which had already been vainly conceived, that the enemy would cease retreating before us and accept battle in positions that seemed favorable to them in order to stop us, was rekindled once again below Vitebsk. After we crossed the pine and birch woods where part of the Ostrovno affair had taken place, after we had encountered a few hundred prisoners, the Russian army appeared in a splendid amphitheater-shaped field, bound on one side by the Divna, and on the other by the woods, that were easy to defend, and whose front was covered by a ravined stream. Everyone, weary of this race to the bell tower with the enemy, hoped for a battle the next day. An order from the Emperor promised us one, but the following day no one was to be seen, and we had to content ourselves with the light fighting that took place on the banks of the small river on the 27th. The enemy had once again slipped away, and was moving up the Divna, no doubt to take up position in front of Smolensk.
Battle of Smolensk, 18 August 1812.
Finally, on 18 August, we arrived within the sight of Smolensk after passing through Lyautey and Krasony, where fighting had just taken place. This small town was to leave an unfortunate mark on my memory later on. On the way there, I found it charming and well situated. Smolensk presents a grandiose appearance from the side where I first sighted it. On the left, the citadel, with its modern layout and green ramparts, immediately catches the eye. Then stretches out a very high wall, cut into battlements and flanked by massive towers of older construction, all preceded by a wide moat with a covered walkway palisaded on the outside. Many bell towers could be seen above the ramparts. A strongly defended suburb could be seen between the citadel and the main gate. This city had once played an important role in Russian history, but had long since been reduced to a secondary position. However, we believed that it would play a new role of the center of a region which we would draw great resources, as a junction of several key roads, and as a base for our future operations. Many believed that this would mark the end of our conquests for the year. Covered by the Dnieper, settled in a stronghold whose military importance we could effortlessly have increased, it would have been simple, according to them, to establish a solid organization in the already occupied provinces, which remained rather Polish than they had become Russian. Their resources would have been employed more judiciously and effectively for the benefit of the army. The cavalry would have been replenished, the stragglers would have been caught up, and it would have been easy to remove any excuse for their absence. Discipline would have been restored, reinforcements would have arrived, and the winter would have been spent fortifying ourselves for the following campaign, which would have decided the fate of Russia in our favor. But who could have made these considerations clear to the Emperor, who aspired only to reach Moscow quickly in order to dictate peace by imposing his laws? September had not yet arrived, and it was only after the fact that the consequences of the early harsh winter we had to endure revealed the seriousness of this sentiment. In any case, the weather was good, the enemy was there, and the first task was to drive them back beyond the Dnieper. Some inaccurate reports had led the Emperor to believe that he would enter Smolensk without a fight, and the first corps that confidently presented themselves before the city on 17 August were vigorously repulsed. Historians of the Russian campaign will recount the different phases of the Battle of Smolensk. My battery played a clamorous part in it and suffered greatly, but my former company, the 5th on horseback, which circumstances had placed alongside with the Prince of Ekmul's corps, attacking the center, fared even worse than we did and lost many men. I knew all my comrades in the unit, and it saddened me. An adjutant, who was acting as a lieutenant and who had been my sergeant major, had both arms blown off. Then we reached the city. I had him placed in the same hospital as my wounded men and recommended him. However, after a few signs of improvement, he succumbed to his injuries. The battle, which had begun for us at daybreak, had a respite for an hour or two around noon. A ravine with a black stream separated us from the Russians. Both sides needed to water their horses, and each side descended into the ravine. We unhitched half our guns, which remained in battery, and I accompanied those horses with some of the gunners. Enough men were left behind to serve the guns, if necessary. The Russians drank on one side, we did so on the other. We communicated with each other without really understanding one another, using gestures. We shared small amounts of water and tobacco. We were the wealthiest and most generous. Soon afterwards, these good friends were firing cannon shots at each other, and I found a young officer who spoke French. We exchanged a few polite words while waiting for something better to happen. We slept on the battlefield. The Russians evacuated the city in an orderly fashion during the night, and I entered it at daybreak. Our shells had set it on fire, and the Russians spread the fire to destroy the resources it might have offered us. The town is built on this slope, and is effortlessly intersected by several ravines, some of which are constructed. The lower part of the city was still contested during the day, no doubt to allow the various Russian corps to take up their new positions and to be able to work more effectively on destroying the pile bridges that linked the city to the suburb on the right bank beyond the bridgehead. My company was among those that guarded the passage by counterattacking the enemy batteries positioned on the slope above the suburb. On the 19th, my battery bivouacked near the suburb, and the following day we accompanied the part of the Guards cavalry that was supporting the engaged troops on the road to Moscow.
From the bivouac near Nyazma, Hubert wrote on 1st September 1812.
My dear father, we were continuing our march on Moscow from Smolensk. We are now only 33 leagues away from the former Muscovite capital. We will be there soon, even if the Russians want to oppose us, for they are clearly unable to oppose us. Since the capture of Smolensk, 2 engagements have taken place in which the troops of First Corps have covered themselves with glory and have not delayed the army's advance. The Russians seem to have adopted a system of retreat, but it is unclear where this will lead them, except to the loss of their provinces and their capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg. It would be better for us, and perhaps for them, if they risked a major battle, the outcome of which, even if inconclusive, could at least delay us until a poor season. The Russians believe they can starve our immense army by destroying the storehouses and taking the inhabitants with them. However, we find chicken and goose feathers in all the bivouacs. If we lack bread, it is because we do not have the time to prepare it with the flour we find in these regions, although meat is abundant. We can easily follow our progress on the map. The land we are traveling through is very beautiful, although rather poorly cultivated. It is very rugged and offers numerous positions that the Russians would be wise to occupy and defend. Our troops have gained a significant advantage. We may rest once we arrive in Moscow.
Battle of Borodino, 7 September 1812.
Inspired by the imposing spectacle of these 2 large armies facing each other, and by the discussions about the chances of success the following day, I was twice as animated on the day of 6 September, which we spent making preparations. Placed in reserve with the Emperor, who had spent the night among the guard, our 2 companies were within sight and hearing distance, so close were we to the Imperial quarters, from where all orders were issued and all reports were received. The weather was excellent on the morning of the 7th. The night had been cold and damp. Provisions had been scarce, and some corps that had arrived late at their positions were unable to make soup. Early in the morning, the troops assembled to listen to their emperor's order of the day, announcing the battle, and, in accordance with the practice of the Imperial Guard on such solemn occasions, we donned our full-dress uniform. History will describe the battle as the Battle of the Moskva, according to us, or Borodino, according to the Russians. Our 2 batteries initially remained in reserve with the Emperor, not far from the redoubt that was captured on the 5th. They were sent out on several occasions, as befitted their reserved positions, to various points where success was doubtful. For example, we descended the banks of the Kolocha to support Prince Eugene, who had found himself in difficulty. We also had to contribute to the assault on the Great Redoubt to come and aid Moran's division. Finally, we were part of the grand battery that General Sorbier, commanding the artillery of the Imperial Guard, formed against the Russian masses advancing on the center of the French army, which initially arrested them, threw them into disorder, and forced them to retreat. At nightfall, we left the battlefield strewn with dead and wounded, to such an extent that, I hardly dare say it, in several places, despite all possible precautions, we were forced to drive our guns and caissons over them. And what fate awaited the wounded in this resourceless country? The only shelter offered to them was Kolotskoye Abbey, which could only accommodate a small number of them, and where the means of healing, even food, were so far from sufficient. Leaving the battlefield under these circumstances, elation gave way to reflection. However, we still retained complete confidence in our leader. After this battle, Moscow could not escape us, and the army would find a favorable position there, which would result in peace and additional glory, as well as the cure for its ills. The night following the battle was cold and damp. Our luggage had not been able to reach us, and we lacked the necessities that might have made it bearable, even provisions. It was therefore a miserable night, spent almost entirely recounting what each of us had done and seen, discussing the events of the battle and its probable consequences.
Arrival outside Moscow, 14 September 1812.
It was shortly before afternoon. The sun was shining on 1,001 domes of churches and reflecting the brilliance of their multicolored roofs. The bow-down hill, Poklonia Hill, where we were standing in part of a series of hills known for their sparrows, which dominated that side of the vast plain where Moscow and the winding Moskva River are located. This plain is lush, fertile, and inhabited. as one would expect in the immediate vicinity of such a large and prosperous city. My eyes were delighted by the sight, and I can picture it still. Our 2 companies were part of the portion of the guard that did not advance any further, and we set up camp to the left of the road, in the woods, or rather at the edge of the woods covering the slope of the hill. The sun had, very conveniently for us to see the city in all of its splendor, a thunderous glow that was accompanied by rain throughout the night. That night is still very vivid in my memory. The cantiniers, canteen keepers, sutlers, etc., who had been in town, it was only half an hour away, had brought back all sorts of delicacies, which we had become unaccustomed to during our time in the bivouac. Our commander had a luxurious tent that only he had allowed himself. It could accommodate us all, lying rather than sitting around in a huge bowl of punch, which was refilled several times and varied with mulled wine, accompanied, of course, by tremendous singing. Meanwhile, the rain was falling heavily, more or less reaching us from above and below, and we did not pay much attention to it. Opportunities to forget our troubles were rare. These troubles had surrounded the army for a long time, and were going to become increasingly apparent despite the brilliant appearance of the situation. Shall I describe the fires in Moscow, its causes, its perpetrators? For that, I will refer to the great personalities for their descriptions of the battle, the movements of friendly and enemy armies, political and military considerations, in short, everything outside the sphere in which my humble self was involved. The day after my arrival, I traveled to the city. It was possible to walk there by crossing a suburb built out of wood before crossing the river to enter the city. Later, our companies were temporarily lodged there. A pontoon bridge, replacing the wooded bridge that had been destroyed by the Russians, had provided access to the city via a ramp that was steeper than was appropriate for the entrance to a capital. Most of the wooden houses were of poor quality, and cabbages dominated the gardens surrounding them. Near the bridge, some of us were busy removing water from sacks of wheat that had been thrown there to deprive us of it. I immediately went to visit the Kremlin, which was still intact, and observed its historical and military curiosities with great interest. The bazaar was already on fire and being looted. I was scandalized to see Allied officers mingling with the looters and gathering all sorts of objects that the fire would, in fact, consume some time later. I can still recall seeing a tall officer from the Württemberg Light Horse, laden like a camel. I had noticed this cavalry unit when it crossed the Niemen River, with its horses, its light stride, and its helmets adorned with large garlands of vines on the front. The left bank of the Moskva River, where the Kremlin is located, overlooks the other bank, and almost the entire city can be seen from these ramparts. It is difficult not to be struck by its appearance. A blend of magnificent palaces, wooden houses, beautiful, expansive gardens, and small plots of land planted with cabbages. My visit was extensive yet limited in some directions by the fire we fought with all our might, as was our duty and in our interest to do so. I repeated this exploration several days in a row, both to complete it and to visit my comrades in the foot artillery. The fire was suppressed as much as possible, and those responsible for spreading it were punished. I saw people from the lowest classes being taken away to be shot, having been caught using incendiary materials. Everyone saved from the fire whatever they thought might be useful. How many charming little light carriages, for example, were seized, no doubt as objects of pleasure, but which were only useful for a short time, since loaded at the time of departure from Moscow with everything that was deemed worth taking, they soon remained on the road with their contents and sometimes their occupants. During my first visits to the city, we had left the camp on the Sacred Hill, and our 2 companies were established in this suburb. It was a shelter, nothing more, and we still had to endure the insects that infested those wooden houses. As for comfort, that was out of the question. There were barely any wooden tables or chairs, and we had to sleep fully clothed on straw. It was only toward the end that I was able to have a sleeping bag made, which allowed me to take off my clothes. Soon there were insufficient provisions for the men and the horses in the area closest to the city. It was necessary to go further afield. But as they encountered the enemy's light troops, or at least armed peasants, separate marauding parties became impossible, and detachments from all branches of the armed forces, including artillery, were assembled each day to search the villages and woods and bring back whatever they could find, which was often very little, and even that was usually disputed. The entire day was spent on these expeditions, the most certain result of which was fatigue for the men and horses, and the maintenance for that taste for disorder so inherent in soldiers who lack everything. I owe it to them for having seen the outskirts of Moscow and the banks of the Moskva River, which form a very pleasant landscape with charming scenery. These forages were only an insufficient relief to the shortage that was beginning to be felt. Our horses were eating only rye straw and rye grains instead of oats. The fodder yielded almost nothing, especially when it had to travel far away to fight instead of gathering it. Transport was not always sufficient, and although we tried to bring order to the chaos, wastage could not be avoided. It was a detestable situation, but we had to endure it. The Russians had repeatedly cut off the route of arrival, intercepted convoys, attacked small detachments, and even massacred transports carrying wounded and convalescent soldiers. All this within a short distance of Moscow. Cavalry and artillery from the Guard were sent to points favorable for this small-scale warfare. I was part of this detachment, and it was not without fighting that the safety of communications was restored. To maintain it, a sufficient force was left in the vicinity, and it was on this occasion that I joined my company in an Imperial chateau whose name escapes me. Those few days of proper rest were much needed. This chateau, more of a pleasure palace than a residence, undoubtedly built with the intentions of hosting parties, was notable for its immense and magnificent ballroom, with a gallery for spectators. The grounds were extensive, containing beautiful ponds, elegant structures, and 2 villages where our gunners were stationed. The plantations in the immediate vicinity of the chateau contained pavilions and small houses that were undoubtedly occupied by the lords and the ladies of the court in opportune circumstances. Meanwhile, grave events were unfolding, and serious difficulties were afoot. I already wrote to you 2 days ago to announce that I would be decorated on the 23rd of this month. This news will please you.
Napoleon himself reviewed the Guard on the 23rd of September. He awarded Hubert the Cross of the Legion of Honor. Hubert would continue to write about his experiences during the Russian campaign, including the upcoming winter retreat. This account was translated into English by Jonas De Neef. If you like this content, make sure to hit the subscribe button to help the channel grow, and we can bring you more videos and podcasts like this. Links are provided in the description below for more eyewitness accounts of the Napoleonic Wars, many translated into English for the very first time. Thank you for watching.